The Widow's Window. Part 1. A New Beginning. John Miller sat on the wooden bench outside his small, quiet cottage. The fresh air of the countryside felt different from the noisy, crowded city he had left behind. He took a deep breath and looked around. The village of Willow Creek was peaceful, just what he needed. John had spent many years as an investigator, solving dangerous cases in the big city. He had seen too much, too many crimes, too much pain. When he retired, he decided to leave it all behind. This village, with its old stone houses and winding roads, seemed like the perfect place to start over. His cottage stood at the end of a narrow street, with a small garden in the front. There were only a few neighbors nearby. One of them was an old woman who lived next door. She rarely came outside. John had only seen her once when he moved in 2 weeks ago. She had waved at him from her window, but her face was hard to see. At night, John often sat by his window, reading a book or drinking tea. It was his way of relaxing, but something unusual caught his attention every night. A light in the old woman's house would turn on at exactly 11 p.m. It was strange because it didn't look like a normal lamp. The light was dim and flickered like a candle, but it was too steady to be one. It came from a single room on the upper floor. John told himself it was none of his business. People had their habits, and he didn't want to be nosy. Still, his curiosity grew. Every night, the same light appeared. He couldn't help but wonder what she was doing at that hour. Why was the light so strange? Why did it always turn on and off at the same time? One evening, as he stood by his window, he noticed something else. The light wasn't just on. It seemed to move slightly, like someone was carrying it. He leaned closer to the window, but the curtains in her house were half closed, making it hard to see anything clearly. Maybe she's just an old lady with odd habits, John muttered to himself, but the thought didn't leave him. The next morning, he decided to visit the local bakery to pick up some fresh bread. The baker, Mrs. Green, was friendly and talkative. She always knew the latest gossip in the village. "Mrs. Green," John said, casually, as she handed him a loaf of bread, "do you know much about my neighbor? The old lady next door." Mrs. Green raised an eyebrow. "Oh, you mean Mrs. Harper? She's been here for years. A quiet woman. Keeps to herself mostly." "Has she always lived alone?" John asked, trying not to sound too interested. "Yes," Mrs. Green said with a nod. "Her husband passed away many years ago. No children, no family that I know of. People say she's a bit unusual, but she's harmless." John didn't press further. He thanked Mrs. Green and walked back to his cottage. The information wasn't much, but it made him think about Mrs. Harper differently. What kind of life did she live all alone in that big house? That night, the light appeared again. This time, John couldn't stop himself. He grabbed a pair of binoculars from his old investigation kit and looked through them. The light was brighter than before. He could see shadows moving inside the room. It looked like Mrs. Harper was standing near the window, holding something, but what? As John tried to get a clearer view, the light suddenly turned off. He pulled the binoculars away and frowned. The room was dark again, but his heart was racing. Why did she turn off the light so suddenly? John couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He decided to keep a closer eye on the house. Maybe it was just his investigator's mind playing tricks on him. Maybe he was overthinking things. But deep down, he knew one thing for sure. Mrs. Harper was hiding something. The days in Willow Creek passed slowly for John. The village was peaceful, but something about Mrs. Harper's house made him uneasy. He couldn't forget the strange light he had seen and how it moved in her window at night. Was it just his imagination, or was there something more to it? That morning, John decided to take a walk around the village to clear his mind. The narrow streets were quiet, and a few villagers greeted him as he passed. As he reached Mrs. Harper's house, he slowed down. Her front yard was overgrown with weeds, and the paint on the house was peeling. The place looked lonely and forgotten, just like its owner. John noticed the curtains in her living room window were drawn shut. He wondered if Mrs. Harper ever opened them to let the sunlight in. He thought about knocking on her door, but he stopped himself. What would he say? That he was spying on her at night? That would make him sound crazy. Instead, John kept walking. He told himself he had better things to do than worry about an old neighbor. But deep down, he knew that wasn't true. That evening, John sat by his window again. He had promised himself he wouldn't look at Mrs. Harper's house, but he couldn't help it. At exactly 11 p.m., the strange light appeared again. This time, it was brighter and seemed to move more than before. John grabbed his binoculars and focused on the window. The light flickered, and he could see a shadow moving behind the curtains. It looked like Mrs. Harper was pacing back and forth, holding something in her hands. What is she doing? John whispered to himself. His curiosity grew stronger. Suddenly, Mrs. Harper stopped near the window. John held his breath as he watched her pull the curtain aside. For a moment, he could see her face clearly. Her eyes looked tired, but there was something else, something sharp and intense in her gaze. It was as if she knew he was watching. John quickly lowered the binoculars and stepped away from his window. His heart was pounding. Had she seen him? He felt embarrassed and a little scared. Why had he been so careless? The next morning, John decided to visit the village library. He thought he might find some old records about Mrs. Harper or her house. The library was a small brick building with creaky wooden floors and shelves full of dusty books. The librarian, Mr. Benson, was an elderly man who seemed to know everything about Willow Creek. "Good morning, Mr. Benson," John said as he approached the desk. "I was wondering if you have any information about the houses in the village?" Mr. Benson adjusted his glasses and smiled. "Looking for something specific?" John hesitated. He didn't want to seem too eager. "I'm just curious about the history of the place." especially the house next to mine." "Ah, Mrs. Harper's house," Mr. Benson said, nodding. "That house has been there for over a century. It belonged to the Harper family for generations." "Do you know anything about the family?" John asked. "Well," Mr. Benson said, lowering his voice, "the Harpers were once very wealthy, but there were always rumors about them. People said strange things happened in that house." "What kind of strange things?" John asked, leaning in. "Disappearances," Mr. Benson said. "Servants who worked there would suddenly leave without saying a word. Some even said the house was cursed." John frowned. "Do you believe those stories?" Mr. Benson chuckled. "I don't believe in curses, but I do believe in secrets. Every family has them, and the Harpers were no exception." John thanked Mr. Benson and left the library with more questions than answers. He couldn't stop thinking about what the librarian had said. Was Mrs. Harper hiding a family secret? That night, John sat by his window again, waiting for the light to appear. At exactly 11 p.m., it flickered on. This time, John noticed something new. The shadow in the window wasn't alone. It looked like there was another figure in the room, standing behind Mrs. Harper. John's hands trembled as he adjusted the binoculars. The second shadow was taller and broader than Mrs. Harper. It didn't move much, but its presence was clear. "Who is that?" John muttered. Suddenly, the light went out, and the room went dark. John stared at the window, waiting for something else to happen. His heart raced as he saw the curtain move slightly, as if someone was peeking through. John quickly stepped back from his window, his mind racing. If Mrs. Harper lived alone, then who was the second figure? He didn't sleep much that night. The thought of the second shadow haunted him. He wanted to believe there was a logical explanation, but the more he thought about it, the more uneasy he felt. By morning, John had made up his mind. He would find out what was happening in Mrs. Harper's house. Whatever secrets she was hiding, he was determined to uncover them. John woke up feeling uneasy. The memory of the second shadow in Mrs. Harper's window stayed fresh in his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that something strange was happening next door. As much as he tried to ignore it, his curiosity wouldn't let him. After breakfast, he decided to take action. He told himself he wasn't trying to be nosy. He just wanted to make sure Mrs. Harper was okay. After all, she was an old woman living alone, and if there really was someone else in her house, it could mean trouble. John walked to her front door and knocked lightly. The sound echoed in the quiet morning air. He waited, but there was no response. He knocked again, louder this time. After a moment, he heard slow footsteps approaching. The door creaked open just enough for Mrs. Harper's face to appear. She looked at him with suspicion, her gray eyes sharp and watchful. "Good morning, Mrs. Harper," John said, forcing a friendly smile. "I'm John, your neighbor. I thought I'd stop by and introduce myself." Mrs. Harper hesitated. then opened the door a little wider. "Oh, yes, I've seen you around," she said in a soft, raspy voice. "What can I do for you, Mr. Miller?" John felt a little nervous under her steady gaze. "I just wanted to check on you. Living alone can be hard, and I thought you might need some help with anything." Mrs. Harper's expression softened slightly. "That's kind of you, but I manage just fine. I've been on my own for a long time." John glanced past her into the dimly lit hallway. The house smelled old, like dust and wood. He couldn't see much, but something about the place felt cold and unwelcoming. "Well," John said, clearing his throat, "if you ever need anything, I'm just next door." Mrs. Harper nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Miller. I'll keep that in mind." Before John could say anything else, she closed the door. He stood there for a moment, feeling like he had missed an opportunity to ask her more. Something about her calm demeanor felt off, as if she was hiding something. That evening, as John sat by his window, he noticed something unusual. A piece of paper was sticking out from under Mrs. Harper's door. It hadn't been there in the morning. Who could have left it? John watched from his window, but no one came to pick it up. The light in her upper window appeared again at 11 p.m., just as it always did. John grabbed his binoculars and looked closely. This time the light was steady, but the second shadow was back. The taller figure stood still, like a statue, while Mrs. Harper moved around the room. John's pulse quickened. He couldn't keep pretending this was normal. The next morning, John saw the paper still lying at Mrs. Harper's door. Curiosity got the better of him. He stepped outside and walked to her house, pretending to check his mailbox. When he was sure no one was watching, he bent down and picked up the paper. It was an envelope, old and yellowed, with no address or stamp. On the front, in messy handwriting, were the words, "For the widow Harper. Urgent." John's hands trembled slightly as he stared at the envelope. Who had left it? What was so urgent? He knew it wasn't right to open someone else's letter, but his instincts as an investigator were too strong to ignore. He decided to return it to her, but first he needed to know more. Later that day, John visited the village pub. It was a small, cozy place where the locals often gathered to chat. He hoped to overhear something about Mrs. Harper. He ordered a drink and sat near a group of older men who were talking about village history. When they paused, John joined the conversation. "Do any of you know much about Mrs. Harper?" he asked casually. The men exchanged uneasy glances. One of them, a man named George, leaned in. "Why do you ask?" John shrugged. "She's my neighbor. Just curious." George lowered his voice. "Mrs. Harper's family has always been different. People say her husband died under strange circumstances." "Strange how?" John asked. "No one knows for sure," George said. "But some say he didn't just die. They say he was taken." "Taken?" John repeated. confused. Another man chimed in. They say something dark happened in that house. Some villagers believe the family made a deal. A deal with something unnatural. That's why no one goes near her. John frowned. That sounds like a story. George nodded. Maybe it is, but tell me this. Why does no one ever see her leave the house? Why does she stay up at odd hours? You can believe what you want, but I wouldn't get too close to her. John left the pub feeling more unsettled than ever. The villagers' warnings only made him more determined to find the truth. That night, John waited for the light to appear again. At exactly 11 p.m., it flickered on. This time, he noticed something he hadn't before. The light wasn't just moving. It seemed to be drawing shapes on the walls. He could barely make them out, but they looked like symbols or letters. John grabbed a notebook and quickly sketched what he saw. The symbols were strange and unfamiliar, but they seemed deliberate, as if Mrs. Harper, or whoever was in the room, was trying to send a message. Suddenly, the light went out, and the house went dark. John waited, hoping for more clues, but nothing else happened. He looked down at his notebook, his mind racing with questions. What were the symbols? Who was the second shadow? And most importantly, what secret was Mrs. Harper hiding? John couldn't stop thinking about the letter he found at Mrs. Harper's door. The words, "For the widow Harper, urgent," kept repeating in his mind. That night, he sat at his desk and stared at the envelope. He hadn't opened it yet, but the temptation was overwhelming. Finally, after much hesitation, he decided to carefully open the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, yellowed with age. The handwriting was shaky and uneven, as though written by someone in a hurry or under stress. It read, "Stay away from the second floor. It's not safe. You've been warned." John's heart raced. He read the note again, hoping it would make more sense the second time, but it didn't. What wasn't safe? Who had written this and why? The message left him with more questions than answers. The next day, John tried to act normal, but his mind was restless. He knew he needed to investigate further. The symbols he had drawn the night before, the mysterious second shadow, and now the warning letter. All of it pointed to something unusual happening in Mrs. Harper's house. He decided he couldn't wait any longer. That night, when the light appeared in her window at 11 p.m., John would sneak closer to her house to see if he could learn more. At 10:45 p.m., John dressed in dark clothes and stepped outside. The village was quiet, with only the sound of crickets filling the air. He stayed in the shadows as he approached Mrs. Harper's house, careful not to make any noise. When he reached the side of her yard, he crouched behind a bush. From this angle, he had a clear view of her second-floor window. At exactly 11 p.m., the light flickered on, just as it had every night before. John held his breath as he watched. The familiar shadow of Mrs. Harper appeared, moving slowly across the room. Then, the taller shadow joined her, standing still and silent. This time, John noticed something new. The taller figure wasn't just standing. It was pointing at the wall. Mrs. Harper seemed to follow the direction of its hand, moving to the wall and touching it. John squinted, trying to see more clearly. What was she doing? Was she opening something? A hidden door, perhaps? The symbols on the wall from the night before suddenly made sense. They weren't just random shapes, they were instructions. John's attention was so focused on the window that he didn't hear the sound of footsteps behind him. A hand suddenly grabbed his shoulder, and he jumped, turning to see Mrs. Harper standing there, her face pale and stern. "What are you doing here, Mr. Miller?" she asked in a cold voice. John stammered, trying to think of an excuse. I was just out for a walk and thought I saw something strange. I wanted to make sure everything was okay." Mrs. Harper's eyes narrowed. "You shouldn't be here," she said. "It's not safe." The same words from the letter flashed through John's mind. "Not safe?" he asked. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Harper didn't answer. Instead, she grabbed his arm and led him back toward the road. "Go home, Mr. Miller," she said firmly, "and stay out of my business." John hesitated, but the look in her eyes told him she wasn't going to explain anything. He nodded and walked back to his house. But he couldn't shake the feeling that Mrs. Harper was hiding something important. That night, John couldn't sleep. He sat by his window, watching Mrs. Harper's house. The light stayed on longer than usual, and he noticed faint shadows flickering behind the curtains, as if something or someone was moving quickly. Finally, at around 1 a.m., the light went out. John was about to close his own curtains when he heard something strange. It was a faint sound, like whispering, but it wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from the walls of his own house. He froze, straining to hear. The whispers were soft and hard to make out, but they seemed to be saying his name. "John, John." The sound sent a chill through his body, and he felt an overwhelming sense of unease. He quickly checked every room in his house, but there was no one there. The whispers stopped as suddenly as they had started, leaving him alone in the silent darkness. The next morning, John decided he couldn't keep this to himself any longer. He needed answers, and he needed them fast. He took the strange letter and his sketches of the symbols to the village library, hoping to find some kind of clue. The library was old and dusty, with shelves full of books that hadn't been touched in years. John explained his situation to the librarian, an elderly woman named Edith. She listened carefully, her expression growing more serious as he spoke. When he showed her the symbols, Edith's face turned pale. "These are summoning symbols," she whispered. "They're used in old rituals to call forth spirits or other things." John's stomach sank. "You mean like ghosts?" "Not just ghosts," Edith said, her voice trembling. "There are stories about things that don't belong in our world. Things that people summon for power or revenge. But these rituals always come with a price. John's mind raced. Was Mrs. Harper involved in something like this? Was the second shadow in her window a spirit, or something worse? Edith placed a hand on his arm. "Be careful, Mr. Miller," she said. "If Mrs. Harper is using these symbols, she's playing with forces she can't control. And if you're not careful, you might get caught in it too." John couldn't shake the librarian's words. Summoning rituals? Spirits that don't belong in this world? The idea was ridiculous, but deep down, he felt it explained everything. The light, the shadow, the symbols, even the whispering walls of his own house. He spent the rest of the day pacing around his living room, going over the events in his mind. Each piece of the puzzle seemed to fit, but the picture it created was something he didn't want to believe. That night, John made up his mind. He couldn't avoid the truth any longer. Whatever was happening in Mrs. Harper's house was dangerous, and he needed to know the full story. Waiting for the clock to strike 11, he sat by his window, watching the familiar light appear. This time, he wasn't going to sneak around. He was going to confront her directly. When the time came, John left his house, his flashlight in hand, and walked straight to Mrs. Harper's door. He knocked firmly, his heart pounding in his chest. For a long moment, there was no response. Then, slowly, the door creaked open. Mrs. Harper stood there, her face expressionless but her eyes full of something he couldn't quite read. Fear, anger, maybe both. "What do you want, Mr. Miller?" she asked, her voice sharp and cold. "We need to talk," John said. "About the light, the shadows, the symbols. I know something strange is happening here, and I think you know what it is." Mrs. Harper stared at him for a moment before stepping aside, motioning for him to enter. Her house was dark, with only a single lamp illuminating the living room. The air inside felt heavy, as if the walls were holding on to secrets. John noticed that the furniture was old and sparse, the kind you'd find in a house that hadn't seen much joy in years. Mrs. Harper gestured for him to sit, but John remained standing. He wasn't here for tea and small talk. "I found a letter on your doorstep," he began, pulling the note from his pocket and handing it to her. It said something about the second floor not being safe. "Care to explain?" She took the note, her hands trembling slightly. For a long time, she didn't speak. Finally, she sighed and sank into a chair, her shoulders slumping as if the weight of the world had finally become too much to bear. "I didn't want anyone to know," she said quietly. "I thought I could handle it myself." "Handle what?" John pressed. "What's going on up there?" Mrs. Harper looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and sadness. "It's not something I ever wanted," she said. "It started after my husband passed away. I was so lonely, so desperate for company. Someone told me about a way to bring him back." John's stomach tightened. "You mean you tried to summon him?" She nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "It was supposed to be harmless," she said. "Just a way to feel his presence again. But something went wrong. I don't know what I brought back, but it wasn't him. John felt a chill run through him at her words. What is it? He asked. What's in this house with you? Mrs. Harper shook her head. I don't know, she whispered. It's not human, that's for sure. It stays on the second floor, mostly. I've tried to keep it contained, but sometimes it gets restless. Before John could respond, a loud thud echoed from upstairs. They both froze, staring at the ceiling. The sound came again, louder this time, followed by a faint scraping noise, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. Mrs. Harper's face turned pale. It knows you're here, she said in a hushed voice. John's grip tightened on his flashlight. I need to see it, he said firmly. If we're going to stop this, I need to know what we're dealing with. No, Mrs. Harper said quickly, standing up. You don't understand. It's dangerous. It's not something you can just... Another thud interrupted her, this time accompanied by a low, guttural growl. John didn't wait for her permission. He marched toward the stairs, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. Mrs. Harper followed, pleading with him to stop, but he ignored her. He had come too far to back down now. The stairs creaked under his weight as he climbed, each step feeling like it might give way beneath him. When he reached the top, he was met with a long hallway, lined with closed doors. The air was colder here, and the faint scent of decay lingered in the air. The growling grew louder as he approached the last door on the left. His hand trembled as he reached for the doorknob, but he forced himself to turn it. The door swung open, revealing a dark, empty room. At first, he saw nothing unusual, just an old bed, a wardrobe, and a small table. But then his flashlight landed on the far corner, and his breath caught in his throat. There, crouched in the shadows, was a figure unlike anything he had ever seen. It was tall and gaunt, its skin pale and stretched tight over its bones. Its eyes glowed faintly in the dark, and its mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. The creature let out a low hiss, and John felt his courage falter. For a moment, he was frozen, unable to move or speak. Then, the creature lunged. John stumbled back as the creature lunged, its bony limbs moving with an unnatural speed. His flashlight fell to the floor, its beam casting erratic shadows across the room. Mrs. Harper screamed from behind him, her voice high and terrified. John felt the creature's cold presence closing in, but at the last moment, he threw himself out of the room, slamming the door shut behind him. The creature's growl rumbled through the wood, and he could hear it scratching at the other side. Panting, John pressed his back against the door. Mrs. Harper stood at the top of the stairs, clutching the banister, her face pale and stricken. She shook her head, her lips trembling as she tried to form words. It's too late, she finally whispered. You shouldn't have gone up there. It knows you now. John's mind raced. This wasn't just a spirit or a shadow. It was something far worse. He didn't know how to fight it, But he knew he couldn't leave Mrs. Harper alone with that thing. He grabbed her by the arm and started pulling her down the stairs. "We need to get out of here," he said firmly. Mrs. Harper resisted at first, but another loud crash from upstairs convinced her to move. They hurried down the stairs and out of the house, slamming the front door behind them. John led her to his home, locking the door and drawing the curtains. For a moment, there was silence, broken only by their heavy breathing. "I don't know how to stop it," Mrs. Harper said, her voice shaking. "It's tied to me. Wherever I go, it'll follow." John paced the room, trying to think. The symbols, the whispers, the strange book. It all had to mean something. "There has to be a way," he said. "What did you do to summon it? Maybe we can reverse it." Mrs. Harper hesitated, then nodded slowly. "There's a ritual," she said, "but it's dangerous. It requires confronting it, bringing it into the open and sending it back." John wasn't sure he liked the sound of that, but there was no other choice. They spent the next few hours preparing. Mrs. Harper retrieved the book from her house, along with a box of candles and a small bag of strange, powdery herbs. John cleared the living room, pushing the furniture against the walls to create a large, empty space. As they worked, Mrs. Harper explained the ritual. "We'll need to draw it out with the symbols," she said, showing John the page in the book. "Then we burn the herbs to weaken it. Once it's visible, we say the words to banish it." The plan sounded simple, but John knew it would be anything but. Still, he nodded and began drawing the symbols on the floor with chalk. Following the diagrams in the book, the shapes felt wrong under his hand, as if they were never meant to be drawn by human fingers. He ignored the unease that crept over him and focused on the task. By the time everything was ready, it was nearly midnight. The house was eerily quiet, the only sound the faint rustling of the wind outside. John and Mrs. Harper stood in the center of the room, surrounded by the symbols and the flickering light of the candles. "Are you ready?" John asked, his voice low. Mrs. Harper didn't answer right away. She looked at the book in her hands, then at John. "Thank you," she said softly, "for staying." John nodded, but before he could respond, a deep growl echoed through the house. The creature was here. The candles flickered wildly, their flames stretching and twisting as if caught in an invisible wind. The air grew heavy, and the temperature plummeted. The growl came again, louder this time, followed by the sound of footsteps. John tightened his grip on the flashlight, though he knew it wouldn't do much good. Mrs. Harper began to chant, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. The symbols on the floor started to glow faintly, their light pulsing in time with her words. The creature appeared in the doorway, its eyes gleaming with malice. It stepped into the room, its long limbs moving with a predatory grace. For a moment, it simply stood there, watching them. Then, with a roar, it lunged. John and Mrs. Harper moved as one, throwing the herbs into the air. The powder ignited, filling the room with a bright, fiery light and a pungent, acrid smell. The creature recoiled, shrieking in pain, its form flickering like a bad signal on a television. "Keep chanting," John shouted. Mrs. Harper's voice rose, her words spilling out in a steady stream. The creature thrashed wildly, its claws raking at the air as if trying to escape. The symbols on the floor burned brighter, their glow now almost blinding. With one final, ear-splitting scream, the creature collapsed in on itself, its form dissolving into a swirling mass of darkness. The darkness shrank smaller and smaller until it was nothing more than a faint wisp of smoke. Then, it disappeared completely, leaving the room silent and still. For a long moment, neither John nor Mrs. Harper moved. They stared at the spot where the creature had been, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. Finally, Mrs. Harper lowered the book, her hands trembling. "Is it gone?" she asked. John nodded slowly. "I think so." The relief that washed over them was overwhelming. Mrs. Harper sank to the floor, tears streaming down her face. John sat beside her, his own hands shaking as the adrenaline began to fade. "It's over," he said quietly. "It's finally over." But as he glanced at the faint marks left by the glowing symbols, a thought nagged at the back of his mind. Was it truly over? Or had they simply delayed the inevitable? He didn't have the answer, and for now, he decided he didn't need one. What mattered was that they had survived. The rest could wait. That's the end of the story. If you enjoyed the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more exciting tales. Check out our other videos and share your thoughts in the comments. Stay tuned for the next adventure. Thanks for watching.